Okay, I want to just go over some tips on citations, quotations, and sourcing. There are lots of different ways to cite. There's MLA, Chicago, Turabian. We APA. We use MLA. The way I do it is your go-to move is anytime you get information from a source, you cite, whether paraphrasing or quoting, the end of the quotation mark. If there's a quotation, author's last name in parentheses, that's your go to. If you don't have an author, you can use the first three words of the title of the article. And if the teachers provided sources like myself, and there's something like source B or document 15, you can do that, especially if it's a primary source. But always, if you have the author's last name, that's your go to. And if it's a book, then you add in the page numbers. Um, you can cite textbook or class notes as well if that's something you got information from. Now, one thing I learned a little bit later on in my teaching is to think about the difference between primary, secondary, and tertiary sources in terms of whether you should quote or paraphrase. And the rule I go by that I learned from some colleagues is generally paraphrase secondary and tertiary sources, only quoting short selected primary sources. So tertiary sources, never quote. Primary sources quote when the wording makes the point better than you could when the language is rich and evocative. And secondary sources almost never quote, only do so when you're quoting a historian's main argument. Okay? Never use a quotation from secondary or tertiary source that's providing information. Summarize that, paraphrase. So forget to quote or not to quote. A Chinese poem for the 15th century, well, that's a primary source, so you definitely could quote from that. A history.com article, that's a tertiary source, so we're not going to quote from that, just paraphrase that. Information from a book written by Eric Foner, he's a great historian of Reconstruction. Well, if it's just information like 600,000 people died in the Civil War or something of the sort, we don't want to quote that. But if it's the thesis from his book, yeah, can definitely quote that. His main argument, his opinion. In a newspaper, these are both secondary sources. In a newspaper article about World War II written in 1914, that's a primary source. So yeah, we could quote it. We don't have to, but we could quote it. Now, another thing I look at is providing context for sources when we write. So there's the citation, like where you put the author's last name in parentheses at the end of a sentence or two of information you've gotten. But then often we want to actually, in our writing, provide some context for high quality primary and secondary sources. Who's the author, maybe the name of the source, and any credentials. Short and sweet. Don't give too much. Now, we don't need to do this for tertiary sources. They're not impressive sources, so we still need to cite it. So if you're writing out, you've paraphrased, you still need to cite textbook at the end. But let me show you what I mean here. According to document 1, does that sound good? I say that as a no, because this doesn't really tell me anything. I want to know who or what in the actual writing, if it's a really good source. The textbook states XYZ. No, textbook's not an impressive source. There again, I would want to just paraphrase the information and then cite it. James Scott, a political scientist at Yale University, argues, now this is the gold standard. This is what we want. Yes, because we have a high quality source, something written by James Scott. He's an academic at Yale. Argues, no, notice here you could either quote or paraphrase. Okay. The Neolithic Revolution was the greatest revolution. That's what I call a plop of a quotation. I want us to avoid that. Instead, you would want something like James Scott, a political scientist at Yale University, argues that the Neolithic Revolution, well, he actually argues it wasn't actually really a revolution. Okay. An article on history.com explains, no, I don't need that. History.com, that's a tertiary source, not so impressive. Instead, would rather just paraphrase that. Where are we here? Skipped ahead. Would rather just paraphrase and then cite it. Here, we'd probably use the first three words of the title, but I'd be okay if you did history.com or something of the sort. It's not going to be an author for that. And lastly, William Wordsworth, the 19th century British poet, wrote, yeah, that's really good. And then that's an impressive source. It's a primary source. It's a poem. You tell me the author, his credential or job. He wrote blank. You could say in the name of the poem if you wanted. And then you give the quotation. And so those are things to definitely look for in terms of how you use evidence, paraphrasing or quoting, and how you provide source context about your really impressive primary or secondary sources that you use.